So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much. This is a quick look at what we're going to be doing this evening. We're going to give you an update about HJR1, SJR2, because that is extremely important and relevant to everything regarding redistricting in Ohio. And then we're going to be learning from our colleagues who have joined us from the Campaign Legal Center. And we'll take your questions and we'll talk about upcoming events. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Catherine, who's going to talk about HJR1, SJR2.
So one of the things I really wanted to highlight is that it doesn't matter what your issue is, we should all be looking at the attack on direct democracy is an attack on voter rights and our ability to take our issues directly to voters. You know, as you know, Ohioans have a citizen initiative. We have the ability to referendum a law that we see as a problem, and we have the right to do a statutory initiative. And the attack on direct democracy, you know, is incredibly galling. So I'm going to go through kind of the history about how Ohio got the ability to do citizen-led measures, and then a little bit about the resolutions. And then I'm going to encourage you to testify and attend hearings next week. And with that, Mia, would you move us to the next slide? So, you know, mostly we think about democracy in terms of kind of representative democracy. You know, we vote for folks that we send to our state house, or we send them to Congress, or they become governor or president. And that's representational democracy. You know, if you think about that as a republic, that's a good way to think of that. But we also in Ohio have the ability to collect signatures, basically all band together, collect enough signatures, and to put proposals in front of voters. And, you know, as you know, this is something that we have had a long time, for more than 100 years. So when we go back and we think about 1912, one of the things I think is important is that there was a time period there where, you know, there was a real concern about corruption at the state house. And the folks that were part of that convention looked at the ability to put things directly before the voters as a check on the power of the state legislature, and an ability to make we the people of Ohio, that starts the preamble of the Ohio Constitution, a reality. Now, when we say it's a power grab, and we're talking about House Joint Resolution 1 and Senate Joint Resolution 2, what they want to do is change the percentage of vote. And you might say, well, wait a second, 50%, 60%, that doesn't seem to be a huge difference, until you realize that we're really talking about, for years, the ability of a majority of voters to approve a change to the Ohio Constitution, and instead they want to move it to 60%. Now that means that 41% of people can actually stop, you know, a really good idea. They could stop redistricting reform. They could stop a change in minimum wage, etc. I included the 2006 Citizen Initiative because, you know, this was one of those things that there was really overwhelming approval of raising the minimum wage. It only won by 56.65%, still a major victory, but it didn't hit that 60%. Now, I also wanted to be super clear that when we're talking about this change here, we're talking about changes to the Ohio Constitution going to 60% in both House Joint Resolution 1 and Senate Joint Resolution 2. It does not impact the ability to do a citizen referendum, and there's no change to the statutory initiative as well. So for those of you that are thinking about, well, what does this mean for the referendum? There is a possibility that House Joint Resolution 1 will be amended next week. But it's important to realize, you know, that at this point, neither of these resolutions actually changes the referendum process. And Mia, if you're willing to go the next slide. I threw in this Teddy Roosevelt quote because Teddy Roosevelt actually attended the 1912 Constitutional Convention. And, you know, when we think about William Jennings Bryan with the kind of progressive era and this sense that we really needed to come together as Ohioans to create a constitution that works well for us. It has worked well for us, for more than 100 years. Now, one of the things that we all know is that it isn't enough just to have House Joint Resolution 1 and Senate Joint Resolution 2 that create 60% passage or approval for citizen initiatives. They also want to establish an August special election. Now, you all will remember how in December, they removed the ability to have August special elections, claiming that, there was a problem with kind of turnout and that kind of thing. But what's important here is that, when we think about this idea that, oh my gosh, it's so important we actually change this. I think it's important to realize, first of all, they're talking about changing and creating a special election in August, which would cost approximately $20 million to do so. They've already identified it as problematic because of the low, really low turnout. The other thing to remember is we have not had an August special election, like a legislatively referred August special election, change the Ohio Constitution since 1926. The other historical thing that I think is important to realize too is there were some worries a few years ago about kind of moneyed special interests using the Ohio Constitution. And Mia, why don't you back up to the last slide? In this particular case, I don't know if you all remember this. One of the things that happened is that there were a number of different attempts for casinos to change the Ohio Constitution to permit, gaming in Ohio. They were unsuccessful until 2008, and there was just this worry that there would be a monopoly, that in fact the marijuana interests would be gathering together and they would actually create a monopoly in the Ohio Constitution, because essentially there is a casino monopoly that is in the Ohio Constitution right now because of 2008. And so there is in fact a protection in our Constitution now. So when people are like, oh, we really need to protect the Constitution, or they say, oh, we need to protect it by moving to 60% approval, it's important to realize there's already a protection built into the Ohio Constitution. And guess what? It wasn't actually passed by 60% of the vote. It was just over 51% of the vote. All right, Mia, if you're ready to move forward. Mia, why don't you throw in some information about the August special election?
Yep. So we have HJR 1 and SJR 2 and their companion bills that establish a special election are HB 144 and SB 92. And as Catherine already pointed out, this is, extraordinary given that we just got rid of August special elections because they're so wasteful and they have such low turnout. But apparently when you desperately need one because you want to ram through a change in the Constitution, then they're fine. And so the whole idea behind HJR 1 and SJR 2 is that the Constitution is such a precious document that we want 60% of Ohioans to vote on it as opposed to only 50%. But they're fine changing the Constitution with about 10% of people voting on it in an August special election, which is approximately what we would assume the turnout rate of Ohio voters would be. So, hypocrisy doesn't even begin to really fully name, what is going on here. And it is, it's shocking really that they would want to change the Ohio Constitution in an election where almost nobody votes. However, we do think that this is probably likely to happen. So we all need to be talking all the time to everybody about the fact that there is likely to be, and we're going to know soon, this August special election, and we're going to have to vote no on this because, this is what they're doing is cementing minority rule in Ohio. So a minority of Ohioans would get to veto anything that the majority want. And we already have enough of that with our state house the way that it is. We don't need more of that.
Mia,
So
why is it they want to do it in August rather than waiting until November?
well, they want it to be in effect before the reproductive rights ballot initiative is on the ballot. So if, you know, if reproductive rights goes through, then, you know, that's, they're missing, you know, that's the whole point, is they want to be able to stop that. And so they want to make this law in effect. They want to change the Constitution, have that be in effect by the time that we vote on any ballot initiatives that would, you know, get on the ballot on November. So we really, really, really are going to have to fight hard. This is a really important one. And, you know, however you feel about abortion, I feel really strongly that, you know, if that ballot initiative were to pass, it kind of shows up the whole fact that the Ohio legislature is not representing the will of the people right now. Like, they are there and they're doing all the things that they're doing, and they're saying, well, we were elected, so we are the voice of the people, but they were elected on gerrymandered maps. And so, you know, having them lose a ballot initiative, as it were, really kind of gives a lie to the fact that they actually represent the people of Ohio. And so that's another, I think that's another motivation, that, apart from the fact that they want to prove to their voters that they're, you know, that they are going to fight against abortion. It has to do with the validity of them as representatives. And then there is going to be a hearing next week. There's a proponent hearing, and then on Tuesday and on Wednesday, there's an opponent hearing. And we have all the information here. We would love people to show up for the opponent hearing, and we would love for you to submit testimony. And we have all the information there. Catherine, is there anything you want to add about this?
First of all, I have to figure out how to come off of mute. I think the thing I want to add is that if you're somebody who can't travel down to the State House, that written testimony also is important, and I would highly encourage you to do so. The other thing is, in follow-up information, as you know, basically the way that it generally works is they identify the schedule, or they make an announcement of the schedule for the Ohio House and Senate, generally on the Friday before. And as soon as we know about additional hearings, we'll also share that information with you, because of course there's House Joint Resolution 1, but there also are the two bills that are focused on actually creating that August special election. And so we should be focusing our time and energy both on stopping the resolution and on just the ridiculousness of spending so much money on an election that is bound to not have really good turnout. And it may be that by the time that we reconvene, that we will have moved to a campaign to actually fight for a no on issue 1 of the August special elections. But at the moment, we shouldn't give up hope. There is still an opportunity to stop this in the Ohio House. The Senate seems a little bit more poised to move. But the thing to remember is a supermajority of both chambers have to pass the same proposal. And the House has had some challenges. You'll remember the speaker fight and some of the kinds of things that have been going on at the House. So the House appears to be the place to focus our energy. So I highly encourage you to make a phone call to your state rep, send an email, come to the State House. It's important for all of us to do what we can to push back. Now, this slide has a bunch of kind of action items that you can do. So, clearly it would be great to actually be able to do kind of letters to the editor. when things are moving this quickly, that means as soon as you have a chance, I think I noticed that Connie Rubin was here. She wrote a lovely letter to the editor. I think it's important for us to do what we can. In many cases, it's important for legislators to see these kind of opinions in their local newspaper, but also they can be picked up by social media. We can share them. And it's so important to do what we can. Now, Bill just noted, this is Bill Davis from Dayton, that Phil Plummer, who is the chair of the House committee, the Constitutional Resolution Committee, that he doesn't necessarily pick up his phone. So if you're having trouble getting through, please send emails, please submit written testimony. Sometimes it's hard to kind of figure out kind of how to talk about this, but I do think, there's the minority rule, like that, the argument of, we are, a democracy conceived on the notion of majority rule, and it actually is an attack on voters. Mia, do you have some suggestions that you'd like to add?
Yes, I just wanted to say we weren't going to go through all of this now, but we always send a follow-up and we'll have, a recording of this, but also all of these links. And there's a one-pager with lots of really great information. So if you're worried about like, well, what exactly am I going to say, or how am I going to phrase it, or what should I put in testimony? Don't worry, you'll have all of this information here. And even in the digital toolkit, we can try to put like a sample testimony. So that is it. And we will see you at the State House next week.
So when you get that follow-up, you'll also have a digital toolkit. So the best way to think about this is if you do the Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, there are images there, and there are ways to educate other people about this attack on voters.
And I think, Catherine, it's time for you to make introductions.
All right. Well, I am so pleased that we are joined by experts from the Campaign Legal Center. I'm going to let them kind of introduce themselves so that you get to know them, you hear directly from them. One of the things that I would highlight is, these are incredibly accomplished, legal experts, and we're just incredibly pleased. So I'm going to start out. Simone, do you want to introduce yourself and kind of kick off the whole program? And you'll notice in the chat, Tiffany added their emails in here, and you can also see their names here. And anyway, welcome, Simone. I'm so glad you're here.
So happy to be here. Sorry, I also was trying to unmute. We're really excited to be here. Thank you guys for having us. My name is Simone Leeper. It says it in a little box and on the screen. And I am one of the legal counsels of redistricting at Campaign Legal Center. Asim is also legal counsel of redistricting. And then Mark, who's joining us, is the director of redistricting at CLC. I think that's the introduction they're going to get until we hear more from them later, because we all just hate introducing ourselves. So I'll get into sort of the nitty gritty and just give you a little bit of background on, I guess, who we are and why maybe you might care about our thoughts on this whole thing. So CLC is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works on a variety of democracy issues, including redistricting, and we are all obviously on the redistricting team. We have sort of a dual approach, and our whole organization does, where we work on both the litigation side of things and the policy side of things. And you'll see, I think, over the course of our presentation, how litigating actually provides us, we think, with a good amount of perspective in terms of formation of policies and looking at sort of what best practices are moving forward and how we can best formulate laws and statutes and constitutional amendments such that they are providing the maximum amount of good and are also protected from future challenge, so that the things that people like you guys work really hard to put into action are not taken down by the courts after all of your hard work. So I think we can flip to the next screen. Great. So this is just going to be a very broad overview. I know all of you care about getting an IRC in Ohio, and so you probably already know a lot of the basics. So I just ask that you forgive me if I go over some things that you all might already know. So basically, there are a variety of different kinds of redistricting commission, and it's pretty in common parlance, they tend to be all referred to as independent redistricting commissions, and that is oftentimes a misnomer. A lot of the commissions that exist around the country are actually not true independent commissions. And one of our priorities is making sure that when commissions are being put through, that they are to the maximum extent possible true independent commissions. That's going to produce the best possible outcomes. So just to sort of give you an overview of the types of commissions so that you can understand what is and isn't a true IRC. Real IRC, Independent Redistricting Commission, is something that fully takes the power of redistricting out of the hands of legislators and really is going to be aimed at creating districts that are fully free from the pressures of partisanship. That's going to be something that will create the maximally, nonpartisan gerrymandered district. Also something that will be more effective at taking into account public input and having that be one of the true priorities and metrics versus partisan pressures from different political actors. There's also political commissions. So political commissions are when it is not in the hands of the legislature, but there's a select group of politicians who are given the power to redistrict. And usually, and with political commissions, one party has a majority on the commission. That is, as you might expect, going to result in partisan gerrymanders to much the same extent as legislators. Yes, you guys do know that. So then we have bipartisan commissions, which are going to have an even split among the political parties. So an example of this is like Washington's Redistricting Commission is a bipartisan commission. This is sort of where the partisan actors are kind of still out for themselves and can make compromises that don't take into the public input to bargain for the maximum political benefit to their party. And then finally, you have advisory commissions. These are fake. They are commissions that go through the song and dance, and maybe it's a really good song and dance of getting public input and creating maps. But at the end of the day, the legislature still retains the ability to redistrict and retains the ability to make a partisan gerrymander or any other flawed map that they may see fit. So those are the overviews of the types of redistricting commissions. Now, basically through our experience in litigating and defending commissions and also working challenging maps under commissions, but you have a number of inclusions that we see as particularly important with IRCs. This is not by any means an exhaustive list. Indeed, if you just put these things in a proposal for a commission, it would be very incomplete. There'd be a lot of things missing. But this is just a few things that we wanted to highlight for you all today. So one of the things is having a clearly delineated term for commissioner service. This is especially important where you have a commission where you are paying the commissioners, which is something that we think tends to result in a more diverse commission. You have a number of people who would not be able to do it if they're not independently wealthy or have some sort of motive that is largely a partisan motive to do something unpaid. But what that means is that there is money being expended. And if you have an uncertain term of service, and this is something that has cropped up in Michigan, they might just continue being paid and it's unclear when it ends. So that's something that you want to have. It's also important to say what kind of a role the commission might have in future litigation. If a map is challenged under a commission, will the same commissioners be brought back? Is that part of their term? Will a new commission be formed if needed? Will the commission be involved at all in forming a remedy map? Are they the body to challenge? So that's something to keep in mind. Something that's really important, and we actually have a whole, I'm sorry, this slide, we're going to be here for a while. But something that's important is commissioner accountability. And so the commissioners should be subject to ethics rules and state ethics commissions, the same as any other public officials. There also should be a legally defensible cooling off period after the fact for commissioners so that people aren't making a perfect district right around their house and running in it the very next year. Conflict of interest exclusions, and also something that we just isn't thought about often is prohibition of employer retaliation, so that your employer, if you take a break or if you are working at the same time you're serving on the commission, they can't be pressuring you to make one choice or another. Redistricting criteria is oftentimes, I think, where a lot of people focus on when they're talking about commissions. And it's the area that I think it can be easy to sort of lose yourself in and fail to wrap your head around and find a lot of debate. There's simple things like contiguity. So you just can't have any islands, separated. A district has to be all in one piece. There's compactness. So a district isn't super wonky is generally what you think about. With that, though not all wonky looking districts are bad. Some of them are remedy districts. Another thing would be partisan fairness and sort of how you're going to measure that, or if it's just going to be sort of a broad principle. This is also where communities of interest come into play. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, this is an area where people can, I think, really get caught up in, but I think one of the things that people forget is that if you have formed a really positive process, you're going to have a more positive outcome. And so I think that this next section with requirements for transparency and public input is actually a lot of the area where sort of I care about. And I think the commissions can really create a huge difference by having requirements for public hearings, both before the creation of draft maps, so that the public has an input right at the outset. Then when proposed draft maps are being put out, so then the public has an opportunity to comment on maps, potentially more than one round of them, and make specific comments about their communities of interest and how they are or are not represented. And then to have the final maps that are going to be voted on published with sufficient time for the community to comment on them. This is something that's really important to make sure that you get maps that actually do reflect the public interest. It's also really helpful if you end up litigating under the map later to have a clear record if, say, a commission goes completely haywire and ignores one, huge community of interest, and there's a very clear record that they knew about that community of interest. That's going to be a lot more helpful down the line if litigation does become necessary. Finally, it's really important to have a fallback mechanism. So there is a chance with any of the types of commissions that they might not actually succeed in passing and agreeing upon a map. And so a fallback mechanism is basically what's the protocol. In the absence of one, sometimes the legislature will say, hey, it's us, we get to draw the map. And that's what we want to avoid, because that's what we're all trying to get out of with IRCs. So a proper fallback mechanism is going to be something that incentivizes the creation of fair maps. And so that means a fallback mechanism that does take it out of the hands of the politicians that have the power right now in the first place. So that's going to be something like having it go straight to a court, perhaps having a requirement for a special master. If you have a commission that has a set number of maybe independents, Republicans or Democrats on it, or major parties, you could have each of them submit a public, a special master, and maybe there's a mechanism for the court to have all of those special masters considered or work together. Maybe they just pick one, whatever it is. This is something that you want to make sure you delineate in your proposal so that you don't end up sort of stranded at the end of the process when the commission doesn't end up going your way, especially when you have unfavorable courts that maybe might not want to then do the fallback mechanism that you would have preferred. If we could go to the next slide. So a great example that Mark is going to talk about in depth as well later is Michigan. Michigan is especially helpful for you all because it's in the same circuit, federal circuit court jurisdiction as Ohio. And so there is precedent right now where the Michigan IRC was challenged. We, and by we, I actually literally mean Mark, he was the attorney on the case, was able to successfully defend the IRC. And so this is why I think it's a really good basis for you all to look to potentially as you're considering an IRC proposal. So basically, Michigan passed their IRC in 2018, and it was just used for the first time, obviously, in the most recent redistricting cycle. It is a true independent redistricting commission where citizens are the actual people that are selected and responsible for drawing district lines. They have an incredibly in-depth selection process that's randomized and sorted through, and it resulted in a commission that it does seem was actually, out for perhaps the right motives, and that's what makes a good independent redistricting commission. So the commission composition was 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and then 5 unaffiliated or independent voters. Next slide. Okay, so this is sort of the nitty-gritty we were talking about earlier with commission criteria. So the Michigan IRC, like all good IRCs, had a set of criteria that they have to follow. And that's that they have to follow federal requirements for redistricting. That's one man, one vote, as you might have heard, population equality between districts. The districts had to be contiguous. They needed to reflect the diverse population and communities of interest. They needed to have partisan fairness. reflect political boundaries. So that's things like states, not having a city split 20 ways so that you can separate up a minority population or something like that. And then the districts had to be sufficiently compact. Next slide. Thank you. Focusing in on the communities of interest piece of this, which I know is where a lot of the confusion and intrigue comes from. Go to the next one. Okay, so here is the requirement for the diverse population communities of interest found in the Michigan IRC. It says that communities of interest may include, but shall not be limited to, populations that share cultural or historical characteristics or economic interests. They are not to include relationships with political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. That's a really good exclusion to have when it comes to communities of interest. You'll see that the inclusion is obviously pretty broad, but that is also helpful in a way because it helps protect the communities of interest from challenge in the courts. You can have ethnicities and race count under this and be something if there's a shared, cultural history there. But communities of interest also can go beyond that. And I think that's something that a lot of people forget. In California, the IRC there has an incredibly in-depth report that they publish every single redistricting cycle where they talk about the communities of interest and they publish sort of many of the comments they received. And you have communities like highway corridors that deal with the same forest fire issues. And that's something that you might not realize or consider as a community of interest, but the people that live there really understood it. This is sort of a bit of an aside when it comes to forming it, but communities of interest also, it's really important to have the input process to learn what communities of interest are, because you have well-intentioned people, like in California, there was a map, one of the proposed maps that came forward, combined two Native communities, and they were different tribes. And in the comment process, they said, we actually don't have anything in common with one another. You made an assumption and it was wrong. They wanted to be, with different, communities. They had different ties that were more important than being combined with another Native community. And so that's one thing that shows how you can have whatever definition that you want, but you need the process to be laid so that you can have a map that properly reflects the community. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to talk a little bit about how he defended Michigan's IRC in our case, Daunt v. Benson.
Thanks, Simone. So as folks may know, the Michigan IRC was passed by the voters in 2018. And so this cycle was the first time that we had a process that led to fair maps in Michigan. And shortly after the initiative was passed by the voters, the lawsuit started. And so there was a lawsuit that was filed by former politicians, former candidates, former party officers who were challenging the fact that they were prohibited by the disqualification provisions from serving on the IRC in Michigan. And they challenged that as a violation of their First Amendment rights under the United States Constitution, that it was impairing or preventing them from engaging in speech through their political activities by limiting their ability to serve in this government job based upon their speech activity. And in addition to that, the Michigan Republican Party also sued and alleged various claims that the commission structure violated its associational rights under the First Amendment, that because Michigan doesn't have party voter registration, that the affiliation of the commissioners with either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or as unaffiliated, that they didn't have the right to exclude those people from affiliating with their party, even though they might not like those people, and that this violated their First Amendment rights. And so those were the basic set of claims. There was also challenges to a provision in the Michigan IRC that prohibits commissioners from discussing redistricting matters outside the context of a public meeting. And there was a challenge to the period of time for which there's an exclusion for former office holders or former lobbyists or former politicians. they also challenged, there was a lot of challenges. They also challenged, and then they're just coming to me as I speak. They also challenged the scope of the disqualification, in that it also swept in family members of any category of disqualified people. So if you're the son of a congressman or a state rep, or a staff member of the legislature or their family members. So they challenged that as well as all of this, for the most part, under the First Amendment. And so that case was heard twice, actually, in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and it failed on both accounts. The first time was on a preliminary injunction where they tried to stop the law before it went into effect and before we had the commissioners, and that failed. My colleague at CLC argued that in the Sixth Circuit that first time, and the Sixth Circuit unanimously upheld the commission as well within the constitutional structure and rights of the state of Michigan to decide who was its important constitutional officers, and so the commission went into effect, and they denied all of those claims. Then it came back up to the Sixth Circuit a second time for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, and weren't at the time and still aren't, but they decided to proceed with the same challenge again. It went to the same judges, and we argued that, and again successfully defended the commission against all of these challenges. And so I think the important lesson that and there was an appeal filed in the Supreme Court at one point, but that ended up not going anywhere. And so I think the important lesson from all of this is that there is a sort of tried and true model in the Federal Circuit Court that Ohio sits in, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And that provides a good sort of grounding and basis for a good commission structure that sort of meets all those requirements that Simone talked about, but that we have the benefit of knowing has been upheld by federal courts, at least for these various kind of kitchen sink challenges that we saw in that case. So that's sort of the overview of the Daunt v. Benson case with respect to Michigan's IRC, and why that sort of seems like something that one might want to wrap your arms around if you are trying to design something that will uphold against federal court scrutiny. And so, Simone, I don't know if you had any closing words you wanted to say.
I don't. Sort of on the last slide, you can see we have two guides that CLC has put out. One sort of a general guide on designing independent redistricting commissions. And I saw a question that was raised about whether states have all these different kinds of commissions. And it's slightly outdated now. I think it's from 3 years ago. So there's been some commissions passed in the meantime. But the appendix of that report actually includes a categorization of all the commissions that currently exist and what category they fall, as well as some additional information about them. And then there's also a guide that we have to designing a transparent and ethical redistricting process, which is some of the accountability and transparency, suggestions that I mentioned earlier. So that's it from us, though. I don't know if anyone wanted to ask questions, and we can do our best to answer them, but I think that's as far as it goes for our planned presentation.
Well, there were some questions, and one was one that I bet you get every single time you do a talk. Why is it we don't just farm this out to artificial intelligence or computers?
Yeah, so that is a great question. And I wish that the technology existed to put us out of our current work, and that it was possible to just throw this to a computer and get completely fair maps. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a fallacy that artificial intelligence or algorithms are without biases. They are imbued with the biases of the people that originally code those programs. So you will have biases inputted in that way, but the air of not having any biases whatsoever. The other thing that is the case is that oftentimes things like that will completely miss some of the communities of interest of the type that I was talking about earlier, where you have these sort of subtle and very human things that are missed. You wouldn't find it on maybe the internet. It wouldn't be something that would be easy to find. These communities of interest aren't outlined on Google Maps. There's something that need to be considered right now pretty much by humans. And that's the unfortunate part of this, and why we, I think, take a lot of time to try to design the best commissions possible, because humans come with their flaws, but they're also kind of needed for this, at least right now. I hope one day there will be something that will just make perfect maps.
Well, and I noticed that Trevor, folks, if you weren't looking in the chat, I'd encourage you to look in the chat, because Trevor Martin threw in some of the maps that were created by folks like you, that were community maps. And this would have been during 2021. So, check those out. One of the sessions that I attended about, thinking about community maps was really focused on kind of keeping school districts together. And it was just a really interesting session. And you can see why it's not enough just to say, okay, let's, put this information in and just let the computer do its thing. That in fact, there are all sorts of criteria that are just best determined and discussed with a commission. So so we've been having lots of conversations. We talked to Anthony Eade, who was a commissioner for the Independent Redistricting Commission in Michigan. We've talked to folks from California and Colorado. And so I know that there's some very kind of basic questions that they have. Do you have a recommendation, for example, for the number of commissioners that you think is important for this system to work?
Yeah, I wish we had a perfect prescriptive answer for the right number of commissioners, and honestly, we don't. And I think that it's just like a Goldilocks situation. You don't want to have so few that it's just controlled by one powerhouse person that can convince everyone, but not so many that it's unwieldy, which is super unsatisfying as an answer. I do want to just say really quickly to the school district's point, which is something that I think seems really intuitive. Obviously, we think our school districts are, about education and they're about our communities. Unfortunately, school districts are not immune from gerrymandering. And we have cases, and there are state voting rights acts actually that just target school districts and ways that school districts have been drawn as racial gerrymanders, or to dilute, sort of the power of minority voters. And so there's all these things that seem like they might intuitively work, but they're all a little bit more complicated. And our local redistricting, the individuals on the local level doing redistricting are also not immune to these problems.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I often think about is how we create greater transparency in the redistricting process, and how that kind of leads to greater accountability. Do you have recommendations for that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you can sort of learn by what's worked really well, and Michigan's process actually did work quite well. They have a requirement. I think the big facets are making sure that you have a phase where there's a required minimum number. It does not a maximum, a required minimum number of public input sessions that are also, there's a requirement for where they are across the state. I know that's something that obviously we're all gathered on Zoom. It's becoming a little bit less relevant, but there are still individuals that will want to go in person. So having a minimum required number of public input sessions before the release of any draft maps, then having a round where there are draft maps that are released for people to comment on, and then also having a section where there are the final proposed maps that the commission is going to be voting on, and having the ability to comment on those final maps. And you want to make sure that there's requirements for sufficient timing between all of those different sections. And then also that there's a variety of different ways to have public input. So you have the oral testimony at these hearings, also the ability to submit written testimony. A big thing is drawing maps of your specific area and having a platform online with the commission that allows people to draw maps for their area. And then those can be taken into consideration as well.
So we had some kind of debate today kind of about whether it was important to actually provide a stipend or to pay commissioners. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough. Obviously, it's always a tough sell to have additional government expenditures. What I'll say is that what we've seen is that commissions that offer a pay stipend to their commissioners do end up with a more diverse commission. And that's in terms of people from different walks of life, so that you don't all just have really rich people redistricting, which also is going to lead to sort of geographic diversity and ethnic and racial diversity, gender diversity. Having that pay stipend allows people to actually focus on redistricting in a way that allows them to make it their priority and actually take in all of this public input. In places where you don't really pay the commissioners, or you're paying them something that's super negligible, you oftentimes end up with people that have a partisan motive, and they're coming in the door and applying to be on the commission because they have an agenda and they're getting something else from it.
Absolutely. Now, one of the questions, I think it was actually from Michael Barron. He was like, do you know how much it actually costs for Michigan to use this new model?
I should know that number off the top of my head. I do not know that number off the top of my head, but the Michigan IRC actually released sort of a lessons learned report that summarizes, and I think it actually does include that total number. So hopefully you guys can track it down, or we can, and send it to you so you have that. There was a bit of a scandal with Michigan where the commissioners did vote to give themselves a raise, which is another thing, that having a set amount of money for the commissioners that maybe they're not within the power to change is something that's one of those accountability measures that we would recommend. And I think that that might have led to a little bit of variation in the price of the commission. That being said, it's not cheap. California's process is really expensive, and so is Michigan. So it's a you get what you pay for kind of situation, where having the time to have that public input, having the resources behind all those things, having a commission that is able to hire, Voting Rights Act specialists and mapping specialists so that they can create a map that truly is good and compliant with the law, is something that's expensive, but it's also a once in a decade cost, right? This isn't something that's happening every single year. And it is something that can be predictable. So it's an investment that I think ultimately is something that for your state tends to lead to better results, because you end up with people getting elected to office that have purer motives. You have better districts. And so I think it's an investment, and it's a once a decade investment in your state.
Well, and it clearly can reduce some of the litigation costs. And as Mia was pointing out, we paid an additional 20 million for an August kind of special election just for the state house. So there was that. So I mentioned Michael Barron earlier. Michael Ahern had a question, and it had to do with kind of the selection of the maps, like how maps were approved. It's our understanding that there's a process if they can't easily come to consensus, where there's kind of this ranked choice voting thing. And so we were interested in how those worked, and like, what are the pros and cons?
Yeah, our report also has sort of a list of the different kinds of selection processes you can have. Some states there's a requirement for, if you have a commission that has a number of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, you have to have a certain number of each of those subgroups supporting an ultimate map. And then, ranked choice voting, we are huge fans of in various ways. And it's something that I think really helps in this area as well, where you can have, it works the same way as all ranked choice voting, which is all a little bit confusing, but ultimately really worthwhile, where you could have commissioners, if they can't in their first round, all just vote on the same map. Everyone can list their first and second and third choices. And then once you have, the cutoff of one of the maps that doesn't get enough votes, your vote transfers to your second choice, and then we do it again. And that was the most possibly basic explanation of ranked choice voting that I'm sure did not do it justice. If you're interested in RCV, campaignlegal.org has something called Democracy U, which covers all sorts of issues, including independent redistricting commissions. It's where those reports that we linked to earlier live. We also cover ranked choice voting and a variety of other voting rights and redistricting and campaign finance issues. So if that's something that you're interested in, campaignlegal.org, and you can click on the Democracy Decoded, the Democracy U tab.
So one of the questions that I have has to do with who do you rule out? So you're more likely to, obviously what we don't want to do is create an independent redistricting commission that has just partisan motives. And so, we've been thinking about things like ruling out major donors and like, well, what is a major donor, and ruling out lobbyists and ruling out folks who are elected officials. Like, do you have recommendations for that?
Yeah, it is really tricky. And this is sort of one of the areas where there's been litigation, not on the front end of who can be commissioners, but also in terms of what you can do after you're a commissioner. And it's a really sticky area because you can run into First Amendment challenges, especially when you have things like the belief that money is speech. And if you've given a particular amount of money to a candidate, if that's going to disqualify you, don't quote me on this, but I could see that as being something that might be susceptible to a First Amendment challenge. That doesn't mean that it's not something that maybe is worthwhile trying for. And one of the things that's really important for IRC provisions is what's known as a severability clause. So that if any part of your commission is found to be unconstitutional, you drop that piece of it, but the rest of the commission remains intact. That's something that's important when you're pushing the envelope a little bit. What I will say is I think, not having elected officials, oftentimes some things like spouses of elected officials or people who've been staffers in recent years, lobbyists, which is something that's registered, with the government. Those are all really viable areas, and our ethics and transparency report covers that. So I'm just like, it's plug city up in here.
So one of the things is, this is Michael Ahern again, and I think it's a decent question. We have a history in Ohio of being redistricting reformers. So the first one that I worked on was in 2012, was not successful. 2005, then 2012, and they were not successful. And then we managed to get this hodgepodge that was a legislative compromise. And I don't know if I saw that Joan Lawrence was on the call, but somebody who chaired the 1981 campaign is often on this, this Zoom, this huddle. So one of the things that we worry about is all of the kind of things that they said during, for example, 2012, they were saying, oh my gosh, these folks are just going to be faceless bureaucrats that are not accountable to the voters. How do people like in Michigan talk about that? Do you have recommendations or thoughts on accountability of the folks who are not elected, but are chosen to represent us all?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has become a very well-known slogan, but originally was founded with some of these, IRC pros efforts, is like the voters, not politicians concept. And I think it can be helpful to point to other IRCs where it was everyday people. You had, your teachers and your doctors on the Independent Redistricting Commission drawing those lines. And I think that's the idea, is that it's actually not faceless bureaucrats. It's not dark rooms. And especially when you have in your provision these transparency measures and say that their deliberation has to be in public, and, they're have to have the same ethics laws as other lawmakers, or maybe they can't meet in private, or they can't meet and be deliberating in private, or all their deliberations have to be happening in public session. That's something that you can say, right now, this is happening in dark rooms. Right now, this is people, we don't know who's actually pulling the strings, but this is something that's going to both make it your neighbors that are doing the redistricting, and they're going to be doing it in public. And you're going to be able to be there watching them, submitting comment, making sure they're listening to you. And I think it is really quite effective.
So one of the things that, this was Jeff that asked, and I realize I'm not getting to everybody's questions, but we're going to be hitting 7 soon. Jeff had a question that had to do with like the kind of criteria, like whether independent commissions work better when there's kind of tighter criteria, or whether, looser criteria, or, hey, keep communities of interest, like what seems to work better in this situation?
Yeah, there's kind of like two tensions at play here. And the first one is that if you make too strict criteria, you might lose some nuance that you find out about later. And so that's one thing where that is in tension with the fact that these commissioners are generally everyday people. And so they do need guidance. And sometimes I think it can be difficult for commissioners if it's too broad. They're not redistricting attorneys. They're not, politicians that spend all their time thinking about this. So there is something there. The other tension is being too specific and being susceptible to legal challenge. So the more specific you get in these criteria, the more specific the legal challenges can be. And the more likely you are going to be to potentially have that criteria overturned in the courts. And if all you have in is, say, a very specific partisan gerrymandering metric, and it needs to be at a very specific percentage of that, and that's your requirement that's in your IRC, if that is then overturned by a court and they say that's actually not a viable metric, you can't consider that, and they scrap it, you now have no anti-partisan gerrymandering part of your IRC left behind. And so that's something that we're still workshopping. And it's really important, I think, to look at the IRCs that exist that have succeeded against legal challenge. And again, Ohio is quite lucky in that it has an example of a independent redistricting commission that has been challenged, and that where the provisions of the IRC have been upheld by your circuit. And that's something where it's really looking to, passive prologue, it's looking to what has worked in the past and what hasn't worked, and where you want to be more detailed and take and roll the ball forward, and improve where you can, while also being sure that, especially for these areas that are particularly susceptible to legal challenge, sometimes it's better to stick with what has worked in the past.
So I wanted to give you a great big thank you, and big thank you to the Campaign Legal Center team. We just really, really appreciate it. Now, we did have a question, and it was actually for me rather than for you all, and it had to do with the testimony for House Joint Resolution 1 next week. Now, you all remember that there was, that basically Scott Wiggum put out these rules saying that only people who were invited could actually come and testify. And I kept waiting to be invited, and I wasn't invited, but the speaker removed Scott Wiggum as chair. And so the new chair is a guy named Phil Plummer. He says that we can, in fact, testify. We can only testify for 5 minutes. You need to provide written testimony by 9 a.m. on Monday. And so you need to get a cracking on getting your testimony together. If you're worried about your testimony or you need kind of another set of eyes to look at it, we're very happy to actually look that over. So the other question that I've been getting has to do with, hey, we've been doing all of these discussions. We've been hearing from Michigan, and we've heard from Colorado, and we're hearing now from the Campaign Legal Center. Well, this is all us trying to figure out a way forward. And the way forward is not with the state legislature. It's with taking an issue to the ballot. So the first step is making sure that we keep it at a simple majority, the way it has been more than 100 years. And as you can tell from our conversations, we're just getting ready to actually do a ballot measure. It's just slow. And I know it seems incredibly slow to you all. We've been at this a really long time. So I want to thank you for patience, but just know that this process of conversation and gathering information is a really important part of things. And with that, Mia, there's some upcoming events that I was hoping you could share with the slides. Looks like Mia has some fun pictures too. So one of the ones I think that's important that's coming up has to do with on the 18th. This is one that's really focused on House Joint Resolution 1 and SJR 2. And this is an opportunity to hear from State Rep Mike Curtin. We include some of his op-eds. You'll get them in follow-up. He just has been a really devoted advocate pushing back on all of the kind of House Joint Resolution 1, SJR 2 nonsense. And for those of you who want to do public records requests, one of the things we know is, it's so important to have transparency, but we need to put those records requests in so that we can really understand what's happening in state and local government. So this is an opportunity to hear and discuss things with veteran reporter Randy Ludlow and the ACLU Ohio's Gary Daniels. We also have a session where we're going to focus on letters to the editor. And so this is with Mary Yost and TC Brown. And then at the very beginning of May, we're going to have a very interesting webinar devoted to looking at House Bill 6 and American electric power. You'll remember we did one that was on First Energy and House Bill 6 and the householder scandal. This really looks at American Electric Power and other utilities and how they have used dark money to influence the process. So I want to encourage you all to join us for these upcoming events. A great big thank you again. I just can't tell you how much I appreciate this. It does look like Trevor has something he wants to say. He's got a hand up.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to point out that that HJR1 testimony on Tuesday is proponent and interested parties. The opponent is on Wednesday, so we have until Tuesday, 9 a.m. to get that testimony in. Tuesday, 9 a.m.
I want to confirm that. We'll send you a follow-up. I want to absolutely confirm that because I would encourage us all to wait until I get follow-up. It may very well be Monday at 9 a.m. because it seemed like it was Monday at 9 a.m. for both of them. Thank you though, Trevor. We'll confirm later. We'll send you a follow-up.
Thank you so much to everybody. It's fantastic to see so many people. And yes, we are gathering information, but we're doing it for a reason because we want to get this right. But the first fight is the fight against HJR1 and SJR2. And then after that, we're going to have our redistricting fight. But it's coming, and all of these huddles have been really, really helpful and informative. And we're very appreciative of all our guests who've been helping us figure out the absolutely best way forward. So with that, I just want to say have a great rest of your evening, and thank you to everybody. And we'll see you at the
Simone.
State
Thank
House.
You, Mark. Thank you, Asim. Thank you, Tiffany and Trevor. We appreciate it. Thank you, Mia.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
See y'all soon.